Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the deck of a creaking wooden vessel in the year 1776. The Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly before you, gray and turbulent, its waves rising and falling with a rhythm that has become sickeningly familiar over the past 2 months. You are a British soldier, a redcoat, and you wear your crimson uniform with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The wool is heavy, the brass buttons gleam despite the salt spray, and your brown Bess musket rests against your shoulder with practiced familiarity. You have been told that this deployment to the American colonies will be straightforward, a police action, some officers called it, a brief demonstration of British military superiority to remind rebellious subjects of their place within the empire. After all, you are part of the most formidable military force on earth. Your army has defeated the French, humbled the Spanish, and established dominance across multiple continents. These American colonists, farmers, merchants, and backwoods militia surely cannot stand against the disciplined might of His Majesty's forces. As the coastline of the New World finally emerges from the morning mist, you feel both relief at the end of the voyage and a strange unease that you cannot quite articulate. You have been trained in the European tradition of warfare, schooled in the tactics that won glory at Minden and Culloden. You know how to stand in formation, how to deliver devastating volleys in coordinated sequence, how to advance with bayonets fixed in perfect alignment. You have drilled these movements until they are instinctual, until the choreography of 18th century battle is as natural as breathing. What you do not yet understand, what none of your fellow soldiers crowded on these transport ships can possibly comprehend, is that everything you know about warfare is about to be challenged in ways that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The British military establishment approached the American Revolution with supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance. This confidence was not entirely unfounded. The British Army of the 1770s represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution, an institution that had refined the art of European warfare to near perfection. The typical British soldier was a professional, often drawn from the lower classes of society, but transformed through rigorous training into a component of a larger, devastatingly effective military machine. The red coat itself was a symbol of this dominance. Far from being a liability, the bright scarlet uniform served multiple tactical purposes on European battlefields. It allowed commanders to identify and direct their units through the smoke and chaos of black powder warfare. It created a psychological impact, a wall of crimson advancing with mechanical precision that had broken the morale of countless enemies. The uniformity and visibility promoted discipline and cohesion, essential qualities in an era when battles were won through coordinated volleys and massed formations. British tactical doctrine emphasized close-order drill, linear formations, and concentrated firepower. Soldiers were trained to stand shoulder to shoulder, often in ranks 3 men deep, creating a human wall capable of delivering coordinated musket volleys that could devastate enemy formations at ranges of 50 to 100 yards. The Brown Bess musket, while inaccurate at distance, became a lethal instrument when hundreds were discharged simultaneously. The effectiveness lay not in individual marksmanship, but in collective firepower, a storm of lead that compensated for the weapon's individual limitations. Moreover, British soldiers were trained in the use of the bayonet, that 17-inch blade that transformed the musket into a pike. European battles frequently culminated in bayonet charges, with disciplined infantry overwhelming enemy positions through sheer physical and psychological force. The sight of a line of bayonets advancing with grim determination had decided countless engagements across Europe. The British also possessed significant advantages in terms of military infrastructure. They had an established system of supply, a powerful navy capable of projecting force across oceans, and access to financial resources that dwarfed those of the fledgling American resistance. Professional officers, many with years of combat experience, commanded troops who had proven themselves in the crucible of European warfare. When these soldiers embarked for America, They carried with them not just weapons and equipment, but a worldview shaped by the military realities of their time. They expected to face the Americans in conventional battles, in open fields where European tactics would prove decisive. They anticipated that a few sharp defeats would break the rebellion, that the colonists would quickly recognize the futility of armed resistance against professional soldiers. They could not have been more mistaken. As you disembark in America, perhaps in New York, Boston, or one of the southern ports, your first impressions reinforce your expectations. The colonial cities, while smaller and less sophisticated than London, are recognizable. There are streets, buildings, churches, and taverns that would not be entirely out of place in provincial England. The colonists themselves speak English, share cultural traditions, and until recently considered themselves British subjects. How difficult could it be to restore order among people who are, essentially, your own cousins? But venture beyond the coastal settlements, and the landscape transforms into something alien and unsettling. The forests of America are unlike anything you have encountered in the carefully managed woodlands of England. These are primeval wildernesses, dense and tangled, stretching for miles without roads or settlements. The trees tower overhead, creating a canopy that blocks out the sun and transforms midday into perpetual twilight. The undergrowth is thick with vegetation, making movement difficult and visibility limited to a few dozen yards. This is not the carefully cultivated European countryside, where battles are fought in cleared fields with good sightlines. This is a landscape that seems designed to negate every tactical advantage your training has given you. Your bright red coat, so effective at maintaining cohesion on European battlefields, now marks you as a target against the browns and greens of the American forest. Your linear formations, the foundation of British tactical doctrine, are impossible to maintain when trees prevent you from standing shoulder to shoulder with your comrades. The American landscape becomes your first true enemy, a relentless adversary that drains your strength and morale long before you encounter rebel forces. The sheer vastness of the territory defies comprehension for soldiers accustomed to the compact geography of Britain. In England, you are never more than a few days' march from a major settlement. Here, you can travel for weeks through wilderness that seems utterly untouched by civilization. The climate proves equally punishing and unpredictable. The American colonies experience temperature extremes unknown in Britain's temperate maritime climate. Summer campaigns in the southern colonies expose you to heat and humidity that transform your heavy wool uniform into a suffocating burden. Temperatures soar above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the moisture-laden air makes every breath feel labored. Soldiers collapse from heat exhaustion during marches, their faces flushed crimson, their bodies unable to cool effectively beneath layers of military wool designed for European weather. The summer heat brings with it swarms of insects, mosquitoes, black flies, and gnats that attack any exposed skin. At night, the whining clouds of mosquitoes make sleep nearly impossible. Soldiers wake with faces swollen from countless bites, scratching at welts until they bleed. What you don't understand is that these insects carry more than irritation. They are vectors for diseases that will prove more lethal than American musket balls. Winter presents an entirely different ordeal. The northern colonies experience cold that penetrates to your bones, that turns your breath to fog and your fingers numb within minutes of exposure. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge becomes legendary for British forces as well, though for different reasons than for the Americans. You watch soldiers lose toes and fingers to frostbite, see men shiver uncontrollably even when huddled around fires, and witness the cruel irony of freezing in uniforms that were suffocating during summer months. The terrain itself seems designed to frustrate military operations. Rivers that appear modest on maps prove formidable obstacles, requiring time-consuming ferry operations or the construction of temporary bridges. Roads, when they exist at all, are often little more than dirt tracks that transform into impassable mud after rain. Heavy equipment, artillery pieces, supply wagons, ammunition carts becomes mired in the muck, requiring exhausting hours of labor to extricate. The forests that cover so much of the American landscape create constant tactical nightmares. Maintaining proper military formations becomes impossible. You cannot see more than a few dozen yards in any direction. Flanking maneuvers and coordinated movements, essential elements of European warfare, are extraordinarily difficult to execute when visibility is limited and communication between units is nearly impossible. Officers lose track of their men. Companies become separated from their regiments. The simple act of keeping an army together as a cohesive force requires constant, exhausting effort. And always, there is the knowledge that these forests provide perfect cover for an enemy who refuses to fight by the rules you understand. Your training prepared you to face soldiers who would stand and fight, who would form ranks and exchange volleys according to the established conventions of 18th century warfare. Instead, you find yourself engaged in a fundamentally different type of conflict, one that feels less like war and more like a prolonged nightmare. The American Revolutionaries do not fight like European soldiers. They do not form neat lines in open fields and exchange volleys at prescribed ranges. They do not advance with flags flying and drums beating. Instead, they use tactics that seem to violate every principle of honorable warfare, tactics that are nonetheless devastatingly effective. They strike from concealment, firing from behind trees, rocks, and stone walls. You hear the crack of a rifle shot and watch a comrade beside you crumple to the ground, but you cannot see the shooter. You scan the tree line desperately, searching for a target, but the forest reveals nothing. By the time you identify a possible firing position and attempt to return fire, the American rifleman has already melted back into the woods. This is not the warfare you trained for. There is no opportunity for the coordinated volleys that are supposed to decide battles. There is no chance to demonstrate your discipline and courage by standing firm under fire and returning measured responses. Instead, there is only chaos, confusion, and the constant fear that death could come from any direction at any moment. The Americans employ what your officers disdainfully call skulking tactics, what military historians will later recognize as highly effective, irregular warfare. Small groups of militia harass your columns during marches, firing a few shots and then disappearing before you can organize a response. They target officers and sergeants specifically, understanding that eliminating your leadership creates disorder within the ranks. They strike at supply wagons and ammunition trains, forcing you to detach significant portions of your force for guard duty rather than combat operations. The psychological impact of this style of warfare cannot be overstated. Traditional European battle, while terrifying, had a structure and predictability. You knew when battles would occur. Armies had to maneuver into position, which took time and was observable. You knew roughly what would happen. Formations would exchange fire, one side would eventually break, and the battle would conclude. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. In America, the war never stops. Every march is a potential ambush. Every night, encampment could be raided. Every supply detail might be attacked. The constant state of alertness, the inability to ever truly relax, wears down your psychological resilience in ways that pitched battles never could. You begin to flinch at unexpected sounds. Your sleep becomes fitful and haunted. You trust nothing and no one outside your immediate unit. The Americans also possess a significant advantage in marksmanship that fundamentally alters the dynamics of combat. Many colonial militia members own and regularly use long rifles, weapons far more accurate than your smoothbore Brown Bess musket. While your musket is effective at ranges of 50 to perhaps 100 yards, an experienced rifleman with a Pennsylvania long rifle can reliably hit targets at 200 yards or more. This range differential creates a deadly asymmetry. American riflemen can engage British formations from distances where return fire is ineffective. They can pick off individual soldiers with aimed shots while remaining relatively safe from British volleys. For you, standing in formation in your bright red coat, this means that you are exposed to lethal fire while being unable to effectively respond. To understand why fighting the American Revolutionaries proved so uniquely challenging, you must understand who these men actually were. They were not the rabble that British commanders dismissively described. The Continental Army and various militia forces drew upon a population with characteristics that made them formidable adversaries, even if they lacked formal military training. Many American fighters were frontiersmen, men who had spent their lives in a landscape that demanded self-reliance, resourcefulness, and practical skills with firearms. Hunting was not a leisure activity for these men. It was a necessity for survival. From childhood, many had learned to shoot accurately, to track prey through difficult terrain, to move quietly through forests, and to survive in wilderness conditions. These were skills that translated directly into military effectiveness in the irregular warfare that characterized much of the American Revolution. The Americans were fighting on their home ground, and this conveyed advantages that extended far beyond simple familiarity with the terrain. They knew the locations of roads, trails, and paths invisible to British eyes. They understood which rivers could be forded and where. They knew the sympathies of local populations and could rely on networks of civilians who provided intelligence, supplies, and shelter. When American forces retreated, they did not disappear. They melted back into communities where they were indistinguishable from the general population. This intimate knowledge of the landscape allowed American commanders to employ strategic flexibility that British generals could not match. They could retreat rapidly when faced with superior forces, knowing exactly where to go and how to get there. They could set ambushes at locations where terrain naturally funneled British forces into kill zones. They could strike supply lines and then vanish into wilderness that British troops could not safely pursue them through. Moreover, the Americans possessed something that proved more powerful than any tactical advantage: ideological motivation. You are fighting because you were ordered to, because it is your duty, because refusing would result in flogging or execution. The Americans are fighting for something they call liberty, for the right to govern themselves, to be free from what they perceive as tyranny. This is not merely rhetoric. It is a belief that transforms ordinary men into determined warriors. This ideological commitment manifested in practical ways that affected battlefield performance. American soldiers were more willing to endure hardship, more likely to continue fighting despite setbacks, and more resistant to demoralization. When the Continental Army endured the horrific winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778, suffering from cold, hunger, and disease, they did not disintegrate as a fighting force. They emerged from that ordeal more disciplined and more determined than before. This was not the behavior of reluctant conscripts or mercenaries fighting for pay. This was the response of men who believed their cause justified any sacrifice. British military leadership in America operated under assumptions and constraints that contributed significantly to the difficulties you faced as an ordinary soldier. Many British commanders initially underestimated their opponents, expecting that a few decisive victories would end the rebellion. This led to strategic errors that prolonged the conflict and created opportunities for American success. General Sir William Howe, who commanded British forces during crucial years of the war, exemplified some of these problems. While personally brave and tactically competent in traditional European warfare, Howe often seemed uncertain about how to prosecute a war against an enemy that refused to be decisively defeated. After winning battles, he frequently failed to pursue aggressively, allowing American forces to retreat, regroup, and return to fight another day. The British strategy of capturing and holding major cities, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, proved less effective than anticipated. In European warfare, capturing an enemy capital typically ended conflicts, as it disrupted government and broke national morale. In America, the Continental Congress simply relocated, and the Revolution continued regardless of which cities the British occupied. You found yourself garrisoning urban areas while American forces controlled the surrounding countryside, creating an exhausting situation where you held territory in name only. Communication between British commanders and the government in London presented another persistent problem. Orders and reports took months to travel across the Atlantic. Strategic decisions made in London based on outdated information resulted in campaigns that made little sense given actual conditions in America. Commanders in America requested reinforcements that took half a year to arrive, if they came at all. This lag in communication created a situation where British forces were perpetually reacting to events rather than shaping them. The British also struggled with coordination between different branches of their military forces. The Royal Navy possessed overwhelming superiority at sea, but coordinating naval and land operations proved consistently difficult. Opportunities to use naval power to decisively influence land campaigns were frequently missed due to poor communication, competing priorities, and the sheer difficulty of coordinating complex operations across vast distances. One of the most psychologically difficult aspects of the American Revolution for British soldiers was the Civil War dimension of the conflict. This was not a straightforward war against a foreign enemy. The Americans were fellow English speakers, people who shared cultural heritage and traditions with Britain. Many had relatives in England. Before the war, they had considered themselves British subjects. The presence of loyalists, American colonists who remained faithful to the crown, created moral and tactical complications. These loyalist civilians and militia fighters were supposed to be your allies, people you were protecting from rebel persecution. In practice, determining who was truly loyal and who was secretly supporting the revolution proved nearly impossible. Communities were divided, sometimes along family lines. You might encounter a farmer who claimed to be a loyalist, only to discover later that he had been providing intelligence to rebel forces. Or you might requisition supplies from a household, only to learn afterward that the family had sons fighting in the Continental Army. The lines between friend and enemy were blurred in ways that created constant uncertainty and moral ambiguity. British forces relied heavily on loyalist militia units to supplement regular troops, but this created its own problems. Loyalist militia were often poorly trained and equipped compared to regular British soldiers. They were also motivated by local grievances and scores to settle, which sometimes led to atrocities against rebel civilians. These actions, in turn, hardened rebel resolve and made reconciliation more difficult, the opposite of what British policy ostensibly sought. For you, as a British soldier, this Civil War dimension meant that you could not trust civilians in ways that would be possible in a conventional war. Every interaction with Americans carried potential danger. The woman selling you bread in a market might be memorizing details about your unit's strength and location to report to rebel commanders. The man offering to guide you through unfamiliar territory might be leading you into an ambush. This constant suspicion was psychologically exhausting and created an atmosphere of paranoia that pervaded British-held areas. If terrain and unconventional tactics constituted the immediate challenges you faced, logistics represented the slow-grinding problem that made the entire campaign a nightmare of deprivation and frustration. Modern warfare has been described as the art of moving and supplying armies, and by this measure, the British campaign in America was plagued by nearly insurmountable difficulties. Every item you needed to sustain yourself as a soldier, food, ammunition, clothing, medical supplies, equipment, had to be transported across 3,000 miles of ocean from Britain or obtained locally in a hostile environment. The Atlantic crossing itself presented formidable challenges. Ships took anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months to make the voyage, depending on weather and wind conditions. Storms destroyed or damaged vessels. Privateers, American raiders operating with government sanction, captured supply ships, depriving you of crucial resources while enriching the rebel cause. The Royal Navy, despite its power and sophistication, could not guarantee safe passage for every convoy. The vastness of the Atlantic and the length of the American coastline meant that determined raiders could intercept supply vessels, especially those traveling alone or in small groups. Even when ships successfully completed the Atlantic crossing, they still had to navigate coastal waters where American forces controlled numerous harbors and could threaten British shipping. Once supplies reached American ports controlled by British forces, the challenge of distribution began. The road network in America was primitive by European standards. Major cities were connected by rough roads that became nearly impassable during wet weather. Moving supplies from coastal ports to interior army positions required wagon trains that were vulnerable to attack and breakdown. Consider the simple matter of food, the most basic necessity for any soldier. British quartermasters planned supply based on European logistics, where armies could requisition food from local populations and rely on established supply depots. In America, the situation was entirely different. The colonial population was either hostile or unreliable. Local farmers often refused to sell to British forces or demanded payment in hard currency rather than the promissory notes that the army preferred to issue. When British forces did requisition supplies, they made enemies of the local population and provided propaganda victories for the revolutionary cause. This meant that you were dependent on preserved foods shipped from Britain, salted meat, ship's biscuit, and other items that were barely palatable when fresh and became actively unpleasant after months of storage. The salt beef was so tough that soldiers joked it could be carved into buttons. The ship's biscuit, a hard flour and water cracker, was inevitably infested with weevils. Fresh vegetables and fruits were rare luxuries, and the resulting diet contributed to the outbreak of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Water, seemingly abundant in America's rivers and streams, presented its own hazards. You quickly learned that drinking from contaminated sources led to dysentery and other intestinal diseases that could incapacitate soldiers as effectively as enemy fire. Boiling water was time-consuming and required fuel, which was not always readily available. Many soldiers preferred to drink rum or beer when available, not primarily for intoxication, but because alcohol was safer than questionable water. Ammunition posed another persistent logistical challenge. The Brown Bess musket fired a lead ball that had to be manufactured to relatively precise specifications. You carried ammunition in a cartridge box, with each cartridge consisting of a paper-wrapped powder charge and ball. An infantry soldier might carry 40 to 60 rounds into battle, which sounds substantial until you consider that a trained soldier could fire 3 to 4 rounds per minute. In an extended engagement, ammunition could be exhausted quickly. Resupplying ammunition required complex logistics. Lead and gunpowder had to be transported from Britain or manufactured locally. Creating cartridges was labor-intensive work performed by specialized personnel. If you became separated from your supply train during a campaign, a common occurrence given the difficulties of American terrain, you might find yourself with a useless musket and no way to obtain more ammunition. Clothing presented yet another challenge. Your wool uniform, while iconic, was not well suited to American conditions. The heavy fabric that provided warmth in British winters became oppressive in American heat. The red dye faded with exposure to sun and repeated washings. Buttons tarnished and fell off. Leather equipment, belts, straps, cartridge boxes, cracked and deteriorated with use. Replacing worn-out clothing required a supply chain that stretched back to Britain. Uniforms had to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic, and distributed to units in the field. The reality was that many soldiers ended up wearing increasingly ragged uniforms, supplemented with whatever items could be obtained locally. Contemporary accounts describe British soldiers in patched coats, with torn breeches, and shoes so worn that they provided minimal protection. This was not merely an aesthetic concern. Inadequate clothing contributed to illness and reduced combat effectiveness. Perhaps no aspect of the Revolutionary War experience was more horrifying than what happened when you were wounded or fell ill. 18th century military medicine was primitive by modern standards, and the conditions of the American campaign made an already bad situation catastrophically worse. Disease killed far more soldiers than combat during the Revolutionary War. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox, and a host of other illnesses swept through British camps with devastating regularity. The close quarters of military encampments, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and inadequate nutrition created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases to flourish. Dysentery, a severe intestinal infection characterized by painful diarrhea, fever, and dehydration, was particularly common and deadly. Soldiers called it the flux, and it could reduce a healthy man to a dehydrated, delirious shell within days. Treatment consisted primarily of attempting to manage symptoms with opium-based preparations. Many men simply died from fluid loss and exhaustion, their bodies unable to recover from the constant draining away of fluids and nutrients. Typhus, spread by body lice that infested soldiers living in close quarters with limited opportunities for bathing or changing clothes, caused high fevers, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash. The disease could spread rapidly through military units, incapacitating large numbers of men. Mortality rates were high, and those who survived often required weeks of convalescence before they could return to duty. Smallpox represented a particular terror. This highly contagious viral disease caused fever, exhaustion, and a characteristic rash of pustules that covered the body. In severe cases, mortality rates approached 30%. Survivors were often left with disfiguring scars. The disease was so dangerous that some military commanders embraced the controversial practice of variolation, deliberately infecting soldiers with small amounts of smallpox material, in hopes of producing a mild case that would confer immunity. This procedure was dangerous in itself and further reduced the number of soldiers available for duty. When you were wounded in combat, your prospects for survival and recovery depended enormously on the severity and location of the wound. A minor wound, a grazing shot or superficial cut, might heal on its own if infection could be prevented. More serious wounds often proved fatal, not from the immediate injury but from subsequent infection and complications. Military surgeons of the era had limited understanding of infection and no knowledge of antiseptic practices. The concept of sterilization did not exist. Surgical instruments were wiped clean between patients but not sterilized. Surgeons operated with bare hands, often moving directly from examining a corpse to treating a wounded soldier without washing. The most common surgical procedure you might endure if seriously wounded was amputation. Musket balls and artillery fragments caused devastating damage to limbs, shattering bones and tearing tissue in ways that 18th century surgeons could not repair. The standard response to a severely damaged limb was to amputate, removing the injured extremity before infection could spread and kill the patient. Amputation without anesthesia was an ordeal almost beyond comprehension. Ether and chloroform would not be introduced for decades. The only pain relief available was alcohol. You might be given a significant quantity of rum to drink before surgery, and perhaps opium if supplies were available. Then you would be held down by several strong men, while the surgeon worked with brutal speed. A skilled military surgeon could amputate a limb in a matter of minutes. The procedure involved cutting through flesh with a scalpel, sawing through bone, and tying off blood vessels with ligatures. Speed was essential, as the longer the procedure took, the more blood you lost, and the greater the shock your body endured. The pain was described by those who survived as beyond the capacity of language to express. A white-hot agony that caused men to scream, faint, or enter states of shock. Even if you survived the amputation itself, the risk of post-surgical infection remained high. Without antibiotics or understanding of bacterial infection, wounds frequently became infected with what surgeons of the era called bad humors, or putrefaction. The flesh around the amputation site would become inflamed, swollen, and would begin to produce pus. what physicians actually considered a positive sign, believing that pus represented the body expelling harmful substances. In reality, this suppuration indicated bacterial infection. Many amputees developed gangrene, a condition where tissue dies and begins to rot. The characteristic smell of gangrenous tissue, sweet and nauseating, became a familiar and dreaded presence in military hospitals. Once gangrene set in, there was little that 18th century medicine could do. Secondary amputations, removing additional tissue higher up the limb, might be attempted. But outcomes were poor. The psychological trauma of amputation compounded the physical suffering. In an era before prosthetics were sophisticated or widely available, losing a limb meant permanent disability. For a soldier, it likely meant the end of your military career and return to civilian life with a severe handicap that would affect your ability to work and support yourself. The pensions and support for disabled veterans were minimal. You faced a future of poverty and dependence, a reality that haunted wounded soldiers even as they struggled to recover. Military hospitals in America were understaffed, undersupplied, and overwhelmed by the constant influx of sick and wounded men. These facilities were often little more than requisitioned buildings, churches, warehouses, barns, hastily converted to medical use. Wounded and ill soldiers lay on straw mattresses or directly on floors. Sanitation was poor, with inadequate facilities for disposing of human waste and contaminated materials. The concentration of sick men in close quarters facilitated the spread of diseases. The medical staff, surgeons, surgeons' mates, and occasionally nurses, worked in conditions of perpetual crisis. They were vastly outnumbered by the patients requiring care. Medical supplies were chronically short. Surgeons made do with limited instruments, insufficient bandages, and inadequate medications. The psychological toll on medical personnel was severe, as they watched men die from conditions they were powerless to treat effectively. Beyond the physical hardships and medical horrors, the psychological burden of serving in America was perhaps the most insidious enemy you faced. You were thousands of miles from home, fighting in a conflict whose purpose seemed increasingly unclear, against people who often seemed uncomfortably similar to yourself. Homesickness was a constant companion. Letters from home took months to arrive, and the knowledge that any news you received was already obsolete created a sense of disconnection from the life you had left behind. You worried about family members you could not help, about wives or sweethearts who might not wait for your return, about children growing up without knowing their father. These concerns gnawed at your morale, creating a background of melancholy that colored every experience. The sense of isolation was profound. You were surrounded by fellow soldiers, yet the shared hardship often created more friction than camaraderie. Men from different regions of Britain, thrown together by military necessity, did not always get along. Regional prejudices, class tensions, and personality conflicts erupted frequently in the close quarters of military life. Fights broke out over trivial matters. Cliques formed and excluded outsiders. The solidarity that is sometimes romanticized in depictions of military life was often absent or fragile. The officers who commanded you were socially distant, members of a different class who purchased their commissions and viewed common soldiers with a mixture of paternalism and contempt. While there were exceptions, officers who genuinely cared for the welfare of their men, the class divide in the British Army was stark. Officers dined well while you subsisted on salt pork and weevil-infested biscuit. Officers had tents and personal servants while you slept in whatever shelter could be improvised. This inequality created resentment that undermined unit cohesion. The nature of the war itself contributed to psychological distress. In European conflicts, there was typically a clear enemy, straightforward objectives, and campaigns that had defined endings. In America, the war seemed to have no clear resolution in sight. Battles were won, but the rebellion continued. Territory was captured, but rebels remained active in the surrounding areas. Each season brought new campaigns, new hardships, and no obvious progress toward victory. The guerrilla nature of much of the fighting meant that you lived in a constant state of alertness and fear. Ambushes could happen at any time. Sentries were occasionally found with their throats cut, killed silently by infiltrators. Supply details disappeared without trace. This constant threat of a sudden violence from an enemy you rarely saw clearly wore down psychological resilience in ways that conventional warfare did not. Many soldiers coped with these stresses through drinking. Rum was a staple of British military life, issued as part of the daily ration. Soldiers supplemented this official allowance with whatever additional alcohol they could obtain through purchase or trade. Drunkenness was endemic in British camps, despite periodic crackdowns by commanders concerned about discipline. Alcohol provided temporary escape from discomfort, fear, and despair, but also contributed to accidents, illness, and deteriorating discipline. Faced with these accumulated hardships, many British soldiers chose the ultimate escape: desertion. The desertion rate among British forces in America was significant, representing a serious drain on manpower and a testament to the unbearable conditions many men faced. Desertion took various forms. Some men simply walked away from their units during marches or while on guard duty, disappearing into the American countryside. Others defected to the American side, switching allegiance and joining rebel forces. Still others attempted to blend into the civilian population, finding work and trying to start new lives in America under assumed identities. The motivation for desertion varied. Some men genuinely came to sympathize with the American cause, particularly those who had relatives or connections in the colonies. The ideological arguments for American independence could be persuasive, especially to soldiers who themselves came from the lower classes of British society and had little stake in the imperial system they were fighting to preserve. Others deserted simply because they could no longer endure the hardships of military service. The combination of poor food, disease, harsh discipline, constant danger, and separation from home became unbearable. America offered the possibility of escape. Vast territories where a man could disappear and recreate himself, far from the reach of British military authorities. The prospect of claiming land and starting a farm, of freedom from the rigid class structure of British society, appealed to men who had few prospects if they returned to Britain. The British Army's discipline system, which relied heavily on corporal punishment, also motivated desertion. Flogging was the standard punishment for a wide range of offenses. A soldier could receive dozens or even hundreds of lashes for infractions ranging from drunkenness to insubordination. The flogging was administered with a cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords that tore flesh with each stroke. Men were permanently scarred, physically and psychologically, by these punishments. Some died from the injuries or subsequent infections. The threat of flogging created an atmosphere of fear and resentment. While officers believed harsh discipline was necessary to maintain order, it also created desperation. A soldier facing punishment for a relatively minor offense might calculate that desertion, despite its risks, was preferable to the certain agony of a flogging followed by continued service in the same miserable conditions. Desertion carried severe penalties if you were caught. The official punishment for desertion in wartime was execution by firing squad. Courts-martial for desertion were relatively common, and executions were carried out publicly with assembled troops forced to watch as a deterrent. The condemned man would be marched to an open area, offered an opportunity to speak or pray, then shot by a firing squad drawn from his own unit, a practice designed to implicate all soldiers in the enforcement of discipline. Despite these harsh penalties, desertion continued throughout the war. The combination of hardship and opportunity proved too powerful for punitive measures to completely suppress. British commanders found themselves constantly struggling to maintain unit strength, not just due to combat casualties and disease, but because men were simply vanishing. The ease of desertion in America compared to European theaters was a significant factor. In Europe, A deserter faced the challenge of crossing borders, navigating populated regions where he would be conspicuous, and overcoming language barriers. In America, vast wilderness areas offered places to hide. The English language was spoken throughout the colonies, so a deserter did not stand out linguistically. The fluid nature of colonial society, with constant movement and migration, meant that a stranger arriving in a new community might not attract undue suspicion. The British Army in America was supplemented by substantial numbers of German soldiers, commonly called Hessians after the region from which many were recruited, though they actually came from several different German states. These auxiliaries were hired by the British government through treaties with various German princes who essentially rented out their soldiers as a revenue source. For these German soldiers, the experience of fighting in America was shaped by all the challenges faced by British troops, plus additional difficulties stemming from language barriers, cultural differences, and the nature of their service. They were not volunteers fighting for a cause they believed in, or even professional soldiers serving their own nation. They were, in effect, military contractors sent to fight in a foreign war for foreign interests. The Hessians' integration with British forces was imperfect. Language differences created communication problems and social distance. British officers and soldiers often looked down on their German auxiliaries, despite the fact that many Hessian units were well-trained and combat effective. This prejudice created resentment and affected morale. The Americans particularly targeted Hessians for propaganda purposes, offering generous terms to encourage desertion and defection. The Continental Congress authorized land grants for German soldiers who would desert and settle in America. This propaganda had significant effect. Thousands of Hessians deserted during the war, attracted by the promise of land and freedom from the military obligations that had bound them in their home states. The most famous incident involving Hessian forces, the surprise attack on Trenton on December 26, 1776, became a significant American propaganda victory. Washington's crossing of the Delaware River and subsequent attack caught Hessian forces unprepared, resulting in a humiliating defeat that the British never entirely lived down. Whether the Hessians at Trenton were actually drunk and negligent, as American accounts claimed, or simply the victims of a well-executed surprise attack under difficult conditions, the narrative of German mercenaries being defeated while celebrating Christmas undermined confidence in auxiliary forces. Certain battles and campaigns during the Revolutionary War shattered British confidence and revealed the depth of the challenge posed by American forces. These engagements demonstrated that conventional British tactical superiority was insufficient to win the war. The Saratoga Campaign of 1777 represented a strategic disaster that changed the entire character of the war. British General John Burgoyne led an army south from Canada with the objective of splitting the American colonies by controlling the Hudson River corridor. The plan was sound in theory but foundered on the realities of campaigning in America. Burgoyne's army, burdened with heavy equipment and artillery, moved slowly through difficult terrain. Supply lines stretched and became vulnerable. American forces under General Horatio Gates, and including the tactical genius of Benedict Arnold before his later treason, harassed the British advance and cut off their supply lines. The dense forests and hilly terrain negated British tactical advantages. At the battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, American forces demonstrated that they could stand and fight effectively against British regulars when circumstances favored them. The American use of riflemen positioned in trees and behind cover created havoc among British officers, who were specifically targeted. British and German forces suffered heavy casualties without achieving meaningful objectives. Ultimately, Burgoyne found himself surrounded at Saratoga, with his supply situation desperate and his army exhausted. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men, to American forces. This was the most significant British military defeat to that point in the war. The consequences of Saratoga extended far beyond the immediate military loss. The American victory convinced France that the revolutionaries had a realistic chance of winning the war. French entry into the conflict transformed it from a colonial rebellion into a global war, with Britain suddenly facing enemies in Europe, the Caribbean, and India. French military and financial support for the Americans proved crucial to eventual American victory. For you, as a British soldier, news of Saratoga was devastating to morale. An entire British army had been forced to surrender, something that was supposed to be impossible. The myth of British military invincibility was shattered. The understanding that this war might actually be lost became inescapable. After Saratoga, British strategy shifted toward the southern colonies, based on the belief that there was stronger loyalist support in the South that could be mobilized to help restore royal authority. This southern strategy achieved initial successes, but ultimately resulted in the decisive defeat that ended the war. British forces captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780, gaining control of major southern ports. These victories seemed to validate the strategic shift. However, controlling cities did not translate into controlling the countryside, where revolutionary sentiment remained strong and irregular warfare continued unabated. The southern theater of the Revolutionary War became characterized by vicious, irregular warfare that made the earlier campaigns in the North seem almost conventional by comparison. The conflict in the Carolinas and Georgia devolved into what can only be described as a civil war, with loyalist and patriot militias engaging in brutal raids, reprisals, and counter-reprisals that devastated communities and made the region almost ungovernable. For British soldiers operating in the South, this environment was nightmarish. You could not distinguish friend from enemy. A community that appeared to be loyalist might shelter patriot guerrillas who would ambush your patrols. Civilians who provided supplies one week might be providing intelligence to revolutionary forces the next. The fluid allegiances and pervasive violence created an atmosphere of paranoia and brutality. American partisan leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens perfected guerrilla tactics in the southern wilderness. Marion, operating from bases in the swamps of South Carolina, struck British supply lines and isolated posts with devastating effectiveness. His forces would appear seemingly from nowhere, attack quickly, and then disappear back into the swamps before British forces could organize a response. These partisan forces were impossible to bring to decisive battle. They refused to stand and fight on terms favorable to British regulars. Instead, they employed hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and raids that inflicted casualties and disrupted operations without offering the British the opportunity for a conventional victory that might have ended the partisan threat. British and Loyalist forces responded with harsh counterinsurgency measures. Villages suspected of supporting partisans were burned. Suspected rebels were hanged or imprisoned. Retaliatory raids targeted patriot families. These measures, intended to intimidate the population into submission, often had the opposite effect. They created martyrs, hardened resolve, and drove previously neutral civilians toward active support for the revolution. The brutality of the Southern campaigns created enduring hatreds that persisted long after the war ended. Neighbor fought neighbor. Families were divided. Atrocities were committed by both sides, though British and Loyalist forces, as representatives of established authority, bore particular responsibility for the violence that devastated the region. The Battle of Cowpens on January 17, 1781, demonstrated that American forces could not only fight effectively, but could outmaneuver and defeat British regulars through tactical sophistication. American General Daniel Morgan designed a battle plan that exploited both the strengths of his diverse forces and the tactical doctrines of his British opponents. Morgan positioned his forces in 3 lines. The first line consisted of militia skirmishers who were instructed to fire 2 volleys and then retreat. Behind them, he placed more substantial militia formations with similar instructions. His reliable Continental regulars formed the third line, positioned on a slight rise. He also positioned cavalry under Colonel William Washington in reserve, hidden from view. When British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton attacked with his usual aggressive tactics, the battle unfolded precisely as Morgan had planned. the militia forces fired their volleys and retreated, which the British interpreted as the beginning of an American collapse. The British pursued, their formations becoming disordered by the advance and by casualties from American fire. As the British reached the Third American Line, they encountered fresh Continental troops who delivered devastating volleys and then launched a bayonet charge. Simultaneously, the militia forces that had retreated earlier reformed on the British flanks, and the American cavalry emerged to attack the British rear. The British force found itself surrounded and subjected to fire from multiple directions. The result was a devastating defeat. Tarleton's force was destroyed, with more than 800 men killed, wounded, or captured. Tarleton himself barely escaped. For British forces in the South, Cowpens was a shocking demonstration that Americans could not only fight, but could execute complex tactical maneuvers that resulted in the sort of decisive victory that British commanders assumed only they could achieve. British General Lord Cornwallis, despite tactical victories at battles like Guilford Courthouse, found his army steadily worn down by the Southern campaigns. The victories were Pyrrhic, achieved at such cost that they weakened rather than strengthened British strategic position. Cornwallis famously remarked that another such victory would destroy the British army. In the summer of 1781, Cornwallis moved his army to the Virginia coast, establishing a base at Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay. The plan was to rest and refit his exhausted forces while maintaining access to naval supply and reinforcement through the Royal Navy's control of the seas. This decision placed Cornwallis in a position that would prove fatally vulnerable. American and French commanders recognized the opportunity. General George Washington, commanding American forces, and the Comte de Rochambeau, commanding French forces, coordinated a rapid movement south from New York. Simultaneously, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed for the Chesapeake. For you, as a British soldier at Yorktown, the situation began optimistically enough. The defensive position was strong, and there was confidence that the Royal Navy would maintain supply lines and provide support. That confidence evaporated when French naval forces defeated a British fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake on September 5, 1781. This naval battle, while not widely remembered by the general public, was strategically decisive. The French victory meant that Cornwallis was cut off from naval resupply and reinforcement. The Royal Navy retreated to New York for repairs, leaving Yorktown isolated. Meanwhile, American and French ground forces completed their march south and began siege operations. The Siege of Yorktown, lasting from September 28 to October 19, 1781, was a conventional European-style siege operation. Ironically, the sort of warfare that British forces were trained for, but now executed against them with devastating effectiveness by combined American and French forces. The Allied forces, numbering approximately 17,000 men, surrounded Cornwallis's army of roughly 8,000 British and German troops. French engineers, bringing European siege expertise, directed the construction of approach trenches and artillery positions according to classical siege doctrine. The Allies brought overwhelming artillery superiority to bear, with French heavy guns supplementing American artillery. For you, trapped inside the British lines at Yorktown, the siege was an experience of gradually intensifying horror. The Allied artillery bombardment was constant and devastating. Shells exploded continuously in the British positions, destroying fortifications, killing soldiers, and creating a hellscape of fire and smoke. There was no safe place. Sleep became impossible as the bombardment continued through the nights. Food supplies dwindled as the siege progressed. Fresh water became scarce. Medical facilities, never adequate, were overwhelmed by the casualties from the bombardment. Disease spread through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the besieged town. Horses, starving and unable to be fed from dwindling supplies, were slaughtered, with some of the meat used to supplement rations. Morale collapsed as the hopelessness of the situation became apparent. No relief force was coming. The Royal Navy had failed to break through the French blockade. Each day brought only more casualties and suffering, without any prospect of relief or victory. Cornwallis made attempts to break out, but recognized them as futile against the overwhelming Allied force surrounding his position. On October 17, 1781, coincidentally the 4th anniversary of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis opened negotiations for surrender. 2 days later, on October 19th, the formal surrender ceremony took place, an event laden with symbolism and bitter humiliation for British forces. The surrender ceremony was choreographed according to military protocol, but every element carried the weight of defeat. British and German troops marched out of their fortifications with colors cased, their flags furled as a symbol of defeat. According to some accounts, the British bands played "The World Turned Upside Down," a tune whose title perfectly captured the emotional reality of the moment. The greatest military power in the world was surrendering to an army of colonial rebels and their French allies. For you, as a soldier participating in this ceremony, the humiliation was profound. You marched out in your worn, dirty uniform, carrying the musket that had proven insufficient to win this war. You were surrounded by American and French forces who had defeated you, farmers and merchants turned soldiers who had somehow overcome the might of the British Empire. The psychological impact of Yorktown on British soldiers cannot be overstated. This was not merely a military defeat. It was a repudiation of everything you had been told about British superiority, about the inevitable triumph of professional soldiers over amateur rebels, about the righteousness of the imperial cause. 7 years of hardship, suffering, and sacrifice had culminated in this moment of surrender. After the surrender, British soldiers faced the prospect of becoming prisoners of war. The treatment of prisoners in the 18th century varied widely, depending on circumstances and the resources available to captors. American and French forces, themselves operating with limited supplies, could not always provide adequate food and shelter for thousands of prisoners. Many British and German prisoners were marched to prison camps in the interior of Virginia and other states, where they remained for months or years, awaiting prisoner exchanges or the formal end of hostilities. Conditions in these camps ranged from tolerable to horrific, depending on location and administration. Disease remained a constant threat. Prisoners who were already weakened by the siege suffered disproportionately from the inadequate rations and shelter. Some prisoners, particularly German soldiers, chose to remain in America after the war, rather than return to Europe. They had spent years in the country, learned its ways, and recognized opportunities that were not available in their homelands. The irony of soldiers sent to suppress American independence becoming Americans themselves was not lost on contemporary observers. Although Yorktown was the decisive military event that effectively ended the Revolutionary War, the formal conclusion of hostilities took nearly 2 more years. For British soldiers still serving in America after Yorktown, this period was characterized by frustration, uncertainty, and continued low-level conflict. British forces continued to hold New York City, Charleston, and several other locations. However, the strategic initiative was gone. No major offensive operations were undertaken. Instead, British forces remained in defensive positions, waiting for political negotiations to determine the final outcome of the war. This period of prolonged stalemate was psychologically difficult. You were still subject to military discipline, still required to perform duties and maintain readiness, but for no clear purpose. The knowledge that the war was effectively lost, combined with uncertainty about when you might be able to return home, created a corrosive effect on morale and discipline. Skirmishes and small-scale engagements continued, particularly in the Southern Theater where partisan warfare had never entirely ceased. Soldiers continued to die in these minor actions, casualties of a war that had already been decided, killed in engagements that would not be remembered or honored because they did not change the outcome. The news of Yorktown's impact on British politics took time to reach America, but it was profound. When word of the surrender reached London in November 1781, the political will to continue the war evaporated. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had prosecuted the war, reportedly reacted to the news by exclaiming, "Oh God, it is all over." The British Parliament began moving toward peace negotiations, recognizing that the cost of continuing the war had become untenable. The Treaty of Paris, formally ending the Revolutionary War, was signed on September 3, 1783, more than 8 years after the fighting had begun at Lexington and Concord. The treaty recognized American independence, established borders for the new nation, and arranged for the withdrawal of British forces. The evacuation of British-held cities became massive logistical operations. New York City, which had been under British occupation since 1776, held not just military forces, but thousands of loyalist civilians who feared reprisals if they remained in the now independent United States. The evacuation of New York in November 1783 involved transporting more than 30,000 loyalists to British territories in Canada, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. For you, as a British soldier preparing to leave America, the departure was likely accompanied by mixed emotions. Relief at finally leaving this difficult posting was tempered by the bitter taste of defeat and the knowledge of what the long service had cost. Many soldiers had spent years in America, years of hardship, disease, combat, and loss. Some had formed relationships with American women and faced the choice of remaining, likely facing hostility as former enemy soldiers, or leaving behind families. The return voyage to Britain was itself dangerous. Overcrowded ships, inadequate supplies, and the ever-present risk of storms made the Atlantic crossing hazardous. Some soldiers who had survived years of warfare and disease died within sight of home, victims of shipboard illness or maritime accidents. Those who successfully returned to Britain found themselves returning to a society that had mixed feelings about the war and its outcome. The American Revolution had been controversial in Britain, even while it was being fought. Many Britons had sympathized with American grievances and opposed the war effort. The defeat, while humiliating, was not entirely unwelcome to portions of the British public who had viewed the conflict as unjust or unwinnable. For returning soldiers, the transition back to civilian life was difficult. Britain, in the 1780s, had limited provisions for disabled veterans. If you had been wounded or permanently damaged by disease, you faced a future of poverty with minimal government support. The pensions available to disabled soldiers were inadequate to live on, forcing many veterans into begging or dependence on charity. Even soldiers who returned physically intact often struggled with what we would now recognize as psychological trauma. You had witnessed death, experienced constant fear and hardship, and participated in events that might haunt your dreams. 18th century society had no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder and no resources to help veterans cope with psychological wounds. Soldiers were expected to simply return to normal life as if their experiences had not fundamentally changed them. The military skills that had been your profession for years had limited civilian application in peacetime Britain. The job market was competitive, and the economy had been strained by years of expensive warfare. Many veterans found themselves struggling to establish themselves in civilian occupations, competing with workers who had remained in Britain and built careers while you were fighting in America. Some veterans never fully readjusted, turning to drink or crime, unable to cope with civilian life after years in the structured environment of military service. Others carried on quietly, their service becoming a defining but private element of their identity, rarely discussed but never forgotten. The British defeat in the American Revolutionary War represented more than just a military setback. It marked a significant moment in the evolution of warfare and the beginning of the end of one conception of empire. For soldiers who served in that conflict, it demonstrated painful truths about the limitations of military power and the importance of factors beyond simple battlefield prowess. The war revealed that technological and tactical superiority could be negated by strategic context. British soldiers were better trained, better equipped, and initially more experienced than their American opponents. The British Army had proven itself in European warfare and was organized and supplied by one of the most powerful states in the world. Yet these advantages proved insufficient when confronted with an enemy fighting on familiar terrain, motivated by ideological commitment and employing tactics adapted to their circumstances. The irregular warfare employed by American forces, the guerrilla tactics, the targeting of officers, the refusal to offer conventional battle when circumstances were unfavorable, foreshadowed conflicts that would become increasingly common in subsequent centuries. The British experience in America presaged the challenges that conventional military forces would face in colonial and counterinsurgency campaigns around the world. The pattern established in America, a powerful military force unable to translate tactical victories into strategic success against a determined, ideologically motivated resistance, would repeat throughout history. The role of popular support in warfare was another lesson written in the suffering of British soldiers in America. In Europe, wars were largely conducted by professional armies with civilian populations playing supporting rather than active roles. In America, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant was blurred. The revolutionary cause drew strength from a significant portion of the population, who provided intelligence, supplies, shelter, and active militia service. British forces could occupy territory but could not pacify it because they could not eliminate the underlying popular support for independence. The logistical challenges of prosecuting a war across an ocean with 18th-century technology proved nearly insurmountable. The 3,000-mile supply line from Britain to America was vulnerable at every point. Even the Royal Navy, despite its power, could not guarantee safe passage for every ship or prevent enemy naval forces from interdicting supply lines. The difficulties of maintaining adequate supplies of food, ammunition, clothing, and medical supplies across such distances contributed significantly to the suffering experienced by British soldiers and undermined operational effectiveness. The statistics of the Revolutionary War tell part of the story. Approximately 42,000 British soldiers and sailors died during the conflict, with disease accounting for far more deaths than combat. Thousands more were permanently disabled by wounds or illness. These numbers, while substantial, do not capture the full human cost of the war. Behind each casualty statistic was an individual human being, a man who had dreams, fears, relationships, and a life that was cut short or permanently altered by the war. There were families in Britain who received news that sons, husbands, or fathers would not be returning. There were children who grew up without fathers. There were women who became widows, facing the economic and social challenges of 18th-century widowhood without adequate support. The soldiers who returned carried physical and psychological scars that affected the rest of their lives. Men who had been vigorous and healthy when they enlisted returned broken by disease, missing limbs, or bearing injuries that would cause pain for decades. The psychological trauma of prolonged combat, exposure to constant death, and the moral ambiguity of the conflict affected veterans in ways their society did not acknowledge or address. For German auxiliary soldiers, the experience was particularly tragic. They had been hired out by their princes to fight in a war that had nothing to do with their own nations or interests. Thousands died in America, their lives expended in a conflict they had no stake in. Those who returned to their German states often found that their service was barely acknowledged, their sacrifices unrecognized because they had fought as contractors rather than as patriotic defenders of their own countries. The loyalist civilians who had sided with Britain and were forced to flee when the war ended experienced their own form of tragedy. Families lost property, businesses, and communities they had built over generations. They became refugees, relocating to Canada, the Caribbean, or other British territories, where they had to rebuild their lives from nothing. Their loyalty to the Crown resulted not in reward, but in exile and loss. The British military and political establishment drew certain lessons from the American Revolution, though not always the right ones. The importance of securing popular support in colonial conflicts was partially recognized, leading to more sophisticated approaches to colonial administration in subsequent decades. The challenges of logistics and supply across oceanic distances influenced British strategic thinking in future conflicts. However, many of the deeper lessons of the American Revolution were ignored or forgotten. The effectiveness of irregular warfare and the difficulty of defeating a motivated insurgency would have to be relearned in subsequent conflicts. The British would face similar challenges in other colonial settings, repeating patterns established in America because institutional memory failed to preserve and transmit the hard-won insights purchased with the lives and suffering of soldiers in America. The American Revolution also influenced military thinking beyond Britain. European military observers studied the conflict and drew conclusions about the vulnerabilities of conventional military forces when faced with unconventional opponents. The ideas of citizen soldiers motivated by ideology rather than professional soldiers fighting for pay gained currency. The French Revolution, occurring less than a decade after American independence, would be influenced in part by the American example. For you, as a British soldier who survived the American Revolution, the meaning of your service would have been complex and perhaps unresolved. You had served your king and country, endured extraordinary hardships, and demonstrated courage and resilience in the face of dangers that few civilians could imagine. Yet your service had culminated in defeat. The rebellion you were sent to suppress had succeeded. The empire you fought to preserve had contracted. There was no glory in this defeat, no triumphant return, no public celebration of your sacrifice. The war was something Britain wanted to forget, a painful episode that contradicted the national narrative of imperial invincibility. Veterans of the American War did not receive the recognition that veterans of victorious campaigns enjoyed. Your suffering and service became, in effect, an embarrassment that society preferred not to acknowledge. Yet there was also perhaps a certain grim pride in having endured and survived. You had faced extraordinary challenges and persisted through circumstances that would have broken lesser men. You had witnessed history, had participated in events that would be studied and discussed for centuries. You had learned profound truths about the nature of warfare, the limits of power, and the resilience of the human spirit under extreme duress. The Americans you had fought against, those rebels who had caused you so much suffering, had won their independence and established a new nation based on principles of self-governance and individual liberty. In the fullness of time, this new nation would become one of the most powerful in world history. You had witnessed its birth, even though you had tried to prevent it. There is a historical irony in the fact that the British soldiers who fought in the American Revolution contributed, through their defeat, to the creation of a nation that would eventually become Britain's most important ally. The special relationship between Britain and the United States, which would prove crucial in the 20th century's world wars, had its origins in the bitter conflict that you experienced as a British soldier fighting American revolutionaries. Why did it suck fighting American revolutionaries? The answer is multifaceted, encompassing physical hardship, psychological trauma, strategic impossibility, and the bitter futility of prolonged suffering in service of a lost cause. You faced an enemy who would not fight on your terms, in an environment that negated your advantages, supplied by logistics that were perpetually inadequate, afflicted by diseases that killed indiscriminately, and fighting for a cause that many of your enemies viewed as tyranny. The experience of British soldiers in the American Revolution stands as a testament to the limits of military power when confronted with determined resistance, fighting for a cause they believe in. It demonstrates that courage, training, and tactical proficiency are not always sufficient to overcome strategic disadvantages and popular opposition. It reveals the terrible human cost of warfare, the suffering endured by soldiers on all sides, and the long shadow that conflict casts over those who survive it. The story of British soldiers in the American Revolution deserves to be remembered and understood, not as a tale of villains defeated by heroes, but as a human story of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, enduring hardships they could never have imagined, and ultimately paying the price for strategic decisions made by leaders far from the battlefield. Their suffering, courage, and sacrifice, though in service of a cause that failed, remain worthy of recognition and reflection. If you found this exploration of the British soldiers' experience in the American Revolution compelling, consider exploring other perspectives on this pivotal conflict. History is never simple, and understanding the experiences of all participants, victor and vanquished alike, provides a richer and more complete picture of the past. Share your thoughts and continue the conversation about how this conflict shaped the world we live in today.